Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel to not miss new videos. So, last year, at the end of August, I had this insane medical scare that completely flipped my life upside down. Everything started off pretty normal, well, as normal as anything can be when you're juggling work, life, and the usual stress. But things started going wrong in a way I couldn't even fathom at the time. I'd been dealing with this dull, nagging pain in my chest for a while, but I figured it was just stress. You know how it goes: long days, late nights, not enough sleep. I was supposed to go in for a pain assessment on the following Monday, but on that Friday, the pain hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just the usual tightness anymore, it was sharp, unbearable, and something felt deeply wrong. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't focus on anything. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I ended up just going straight to the doctor that day, barely making it out the door. I remember feeling like I was going to collapse at any moment, but somehow, I pushed through. When I got to the doctor, I was expecting some routine checks and maybe a prescription for painkillers. But what happened next was something I will never forget. The doctor looked at me, pale, and said, "If you'd waited until Monday, you wouldn't be here to tell this story." I had a pulmonary embolism. I'm not a doctor, so I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time, but the words "you would have died" hit me like a freight train. It was surreal, like something out of a movie. And that was just the beginning. In that moment, I was in shock. I don't know if I actually understood what was happening or if my brain just couldn't process it all at once. It was like a movie where everything slows down, but you're still standing there, frozen. Pulmonary embolism. I could barely wrap my head around it. The word death wasn't even something I could bring myself to say out loud. At first, I was pissed off. Like, how could I have missed this? I mean, I had chest pain, right? I ignored it for weeks, thinking it was nothing. I had grown so accustomed to dismissing things as just part of daily life: stress, tiredness, pressure. But now I was sitting there, on the edge of my seat, trying not to completely lose it. I felt stupid. I felt guilty. Like I had somehow brought this on myself by not paying attention sooner. But then, after the anger came the sadness. A deep, soul-crushing sadness. I started thinking about everything I could have lost: my wife, my family, my friends. What would they do without me? What would they say when they found out I nearly didn't make it? I don't think I've ever felt so small. My mind kept running through all the moments I took for granted, all the things I never thought I'd miss until I was staring death in the face. I wanted to scream, but instead, I sat there, numb, as the doctor explained what would happen next. I couldn't even pay attention to the details of the treatment. I was too focused on the overwhelming realization that this could have been it. If I had ignored it just one more day, I wouldn't be telling you this story. And that was a tough pill to swallow. The days after the diagnosis were a blur. I was admitted to the hospital for treatment, and let me tell you, being hooked up to IVs and monitors made everything feel so surreal. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to not making it. Every breath I took felt like a reminder of just how fragile life is. It wasn't just physical recovery, it was mental, emotional. It hit me in ways I never expected. And, of course, I had to tell my wife. That was the hardest part. You know, when you're married, you think about how you'd share the big moments, the milestones, the celebrations, the plans for the future. You don't really picture telling your spouse you almost died. I couldn't stop thinking about the what ifs. What if I had waited? What if it had been worse? What if I'd been at home alone? When I told her, she didn't even know how to react at first. Her face went pale, and she started asking a million questions I didn't have answers to. I could see the fear in her eyes, and that hurt more than the pain in my chest ever did. She said she didn't want to lose me. Of course, she didn't. But it made me think about everything I had taken for granted in our relationship. The late nights working, the casual chats, the plans we had. It was all so fragile. In that moment, I realized how much I'd been neglecting life, my health, my relationships. The doctor was blunt. Thankfully, I was responding well to the treatment. But my mind kept coming back to one thought: how had I gotten here? How had I let myself go on autopilot for so long that I didn't even notice the warning signs? It didn't take long for the guilt to creep in. And when I say creep in, I mean it practically consumed me. I felt like I'd been given a second chance at life, but all I could focus on was how I had almost thrown it away. The "why didn't I do something sooner" thoughts kept looping in my mind, making it impossible to think about anything else. I started questioning everything I'd done up until that point, everything I had been neglecting. I felt like I had taken my health for granted, thinking I could just push through the pain. How could I have been so careless? How could I have been so selfish to not take care of myself? My wife, my family, my friends, they all cared about me, and I had been blind to that care until it almost cost me everything. I began to wonder if I had been subconsciously preparing myself for some kind of disaster. I had always been one to keep my emotions at bay, to avoid facing the truth about my own mortality. It was like I was so wrapped up in my day-to-day grind that I forgot to check in with myself, to ask if I was truly okay. And now, I was paying the price. I felt responsible for everything that had happened, even though I knew, deep down, it wasn't entirely my fault. But that guilt was like a weight on my chest that no doctor could fix. It made me second-guess every decision I had ever made. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't angry at myself for not listening to my body sooner. As the days passed, I started to reflect more deeply on everything: my health, my choices, my relationships. The guilt didn't exactly disappear, but it started to evolve into something different. It was like this painful clarity came over me. I realized I had been living life like it was guaranteed. I thought there would always be a tomorrow, always another chance. But what if there wasn't? I wasn't just angry at myself anymore. I was angry at the way I had lived, like I had been sleepwalking through my own life. I thought I was handling everything by pushing through, by working harder, ignoring the signs of stress and physical strain. But I hadn't been living. I had been surviving. That realization hit me hard. I started asking myself tough questions. Why was I working so hard? What was I really trying to achieve? Was it worth sacrificing my health, my peace of mind, and my relationships for a job, for goals that could always wait? It was as if the universe had smacked me across the face with a cold, hard truth. I wasn't invincible. I could go at any moment, and I was squandering precious time focusing on things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I realized I needed to change. It wasn't just about getting better physically, it was about taking control of my life again, slowing down, and focusing on what truly mattered. That meant more than just health. It meant reconnecting with the people who cared about me, prioritizing my well-being, and actually enjoying life instead of rushing through it. After everything that happened, I knew I had to make some serious changes. It wasn't going to be easy, and honestly, I didn't even know where to start. But the one thing I was certain about was that I couldn't keep living the way I had been. So, I started small. I knew it wouldn't be a quick fix, but it had to be a start. First, I cut back on my work hours. It felt weird at first. For years, I had been so invested in my career, thinking that everything else came second. I thought working longer meant more success, more validation. But what did it actually bring me? Stress, burnout, and a whole lot of anxiety. I realized that if I kept going down that path, I was going to end up in the hospital again, or worse. Next, I made a point of spending more time with my wife. We'd grown distant without even realizing it. Between work, personal stress, and just the rush of life, we hadn't been truly present with each other in a long time. I started carving out time for us, going on walks, having real conversations, and just being there for each other without distractions. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about being intentional with our time and making sure we were a priority in each other's lives. Then, I began taking my health seriously. That meant regular doctor's visits, more exercise, and finally stopping the endless cycle of putting my needs last. I had to face the reality that I couldn't keep ignoring my body, and I certainly couldn't keep pretending I was invincible. I had to listen to the signals it was giving me, even if that meant slowing down or asking for help. It wasn't easy. I won't lie. Old habits die hard, and sometimes it felt like I was undoing everything I had worked so hard to build. But it also felt right. I knew I had to make these changes, or I'd be risking more than just my health. I'd be risking my future. Making these changes wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. There were moments when I felt frustrated, like I was trying to swim against the current. I'd get a reminder from work about a deadline or a meeting, and I'd feel that familiar pressure building up in my chest. My mind would race, thinking about all the things I wasn't doing and all the ways I could be better or more productive. But then I'd remember why I was making these changes. I had almost died. I wasn't about to let that happen again because I couldn't manage my time properly or prioritize the things that actually mattered. I had to remind myself over and over that it was okay to step back. It was okay to say no to work and yes to my health. I had to stop measuring my worth by how much I could accomplish in a day. The hardest part was dealing with the internal conflict. It was like I had this voice in my head telling me I was being lazy or that I wasn't doing enough. But I had to push back against that voice. I had to reprogram myself to believe that taking care of myself was more important than running myself into the ground. That it was okay to have downtime, to rest, to enjoy life. There were nights when I felt guilty for not working late, for not being glued to my email or phone. I'd think about all the things I should be doing, and I'd start second-guessing myself. But then I'd remember how far I'd come and how much I had to lose if I went back to the old ways. It wasn't perfect, but I could feel the difference. Slowly, I started to feel like I was gaining control over my life again, instead of being controlled by it. I realized it wasn't about doing everything right, it was about doing what was right for me, and that was something I had forgotten for far too long. One of the most surprising outcomes of this experience was how much it changed my perspective on the people in my life. Before all of this happened, I had been so caught up in my own world, wrapped up in my work and personal struggles, that I hadn't noticed how much I had pulled away from the people who truly cared about me. My wife, for one, was a rock through all of it. I had taken her presence for granted, assuming she'd always be there, never really thinking about the toll my neglect was taking on her. When I was in the hospital, I realized just how much she had supported me, even when I hadn't made the effort. After everything, I knew I had to make up for that. We started spending more time together, doing the simple things that had slipped through the cracks before. We'd go out for dinner on random nights, even if it was just a quick bite, and talk about our day like we used to. No work, no distractions. Just us. It wasn't about solving any huge problems, but about being present. And it felt good. Then, I began reaching out to other people in my life, friends, family, old coworkers. People I hadn't checked in with in months, or even years. I realized how much I had let those relationships wither away because I was too wrapped up in my own little bubble. I didn't just want to survive anymore, I wanted to live fully, and with the people I loved by my side. Some relationships were easy to reconnect with, while others took more work. But I didn't mind. I had learned that life is too short to ignore the people who matter. That's when I understood the true value of these connections, not just the support, but the joy, the laughter, and the comfort they brought into my life. I hadn't realized how much I needed that until I almost lost everything. As time went on, I began to feel a sense of peace settle in. It wasn't immediate, and it didn't happen all at once. But with each passing day, I found myself breathing a little easier. The anxiety that had once gripped me, especially around work and responsibilities, slowly started to loosen its hold. I was no longer rushing from one thing to the next, scrambling to meet expectations. Instead, I was learning to appreciate the still moments. I started enjoying the small things, the morning coffee, the quiet walks after dinner, the sound of my wife's laugh when she made a joke. These were things I used to overlook, but now they felt like treasures. I realized that all the stuff I used to stress about, the deadlines, the pressure, the endless to-do lists, could wait. What really mattered was this. The hospital experience had shaken me to my core, but in a way, it gave me a clarity I didn't have before. I started to feel less worried about what might go wrong and more grateful for what was going right. I wasn't perfect, but I was moving in the right direction. And that felt like enough. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for what I had gone through. It was hard, painful even, but it forced me to look at my life with new eyes. The fear of death, of losing everything, had been a wake-up call. It helped me realize that I didn't have to keep living in fear of failure or making mistakes. I could take a step back and enjoy the process, rather than just focusing on the end result. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control, not of everything, but of the things that mattered. And that brought me a kind of peace I hadn't known I needed. One of the biggest shifts that came after the pulmonary embolism was how I started to reframe my priorities. Before, I had been so focused on achieving external success, climbing the career ladder, making more money, meeting expectations, that I had completely neglected the internal side of my life. My health, my relationships, my own happiness, they were always secondary to what I thought I needed to achieve. After everything that happened, I realized how backwards that approach was. Success didn't matter as much as I thought it did. I mean, don't get me wrong, work is important, and it provides stability and a sense of purpose. But it's not everything. What good is a successful career if you don't have the health or relationships to enjoy it? What good is any accomplishment if you're too exhausted or disconnected to appreciate it? I began to challenge my own beliefs about what I thought was important. I started questioning why I was chasing certain things and whether they were truly aligned with the life I wanted to live. Was I working so hard because I loved what I did, or was I doing it to prove something to myself or others? Was I keeping up with relationships because I cared, or because it was expected? I learned that I needed to focus on what gave me real fulfillment, spending time with the people I love, focusing on my well-being, and giving myself permission to not always be on. I was finally able to let go of the pressure to perform, to achieve, to be perfect. I realized that being present, being healthy, and being connected were the things that actually made life worth living. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. And I'm not saying I've figured it all out, I still slip into old habits sometimes. But now, when I feel that pressure building, I stop and ask myself, is this worth my health? My peace of mind? The people who care about me? And if the answer is no, I make a different choice. One of the most unexpected results of everything that happened was reconnecting with myself. Before the pulmonary embolism, I had been so focused on external validation, on what others thought of me, on achieving certain goals, that I had completely lost touch with who I was at my core. I'd stopped asking myself what I actually wanted from life, and instead, I had been living according to what I thought was expected. After I nearly died, I had no choice but to reassess everything. I needed to take a step back, clear the clutter in my life, and figure out what truly mattered to me, not what I thought should matter, but what really did. I realized I had been so caught up in trying to prove something to the world that I had forgotten to ask myself, what do I want? It wasn't an easy journey. I had to spend time alone, reflecting and being honest with myself about my desires, my fears, and my long-term goals. I had to confront the fact that I had been ignoring my own inner voice, letting the noise of external expectations drown it out. But slowly, I started to hear that voice again. And as I did, I began to understand who I really was and what I truly valued. This process wasn't about changing who I was, it was about stripping away all the layers of expectation, judgment, and pressure that had built up over the years. It was about reconnecting with the part of me that had always known what was important, but had been buried under the weight of everything else. I started making decisions that aligned with my true self, even if they were uncomfortable at first. I began saying no to things that didn't serve me, and saying yes to experiences that brought me joy and fulfillment. I realized that taking care of myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I had to take care of myself first before I could truly take care of anything or anyone else. That process of rediscovery wasn't fast, but it was freeing. I stopped worrying about what others thought and started focusing on what made me feel alive, peaceful, and content. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally living for myself. As I continued to recover, I realized something that was both frightening and liberating. I had been living my life in fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough. I had built my entire existence around this constant anxiety, trying to meet impossible standards and avoid making mistakes. But after the pulmonary embolism, I couldn't keep living that way. I had come face to face with mortality, and it shook me to the core. I'd spent so much time worrying about things that didn't matter, and I had neglected the things that truly did. But I couldn't hide from my fears anymore. I had to confront them head on. the hardest part was acknowledging that I wasn't invincible. For so long, I thought I could power through anything, that my health would always hold up. But that wasn't true. The truth is, we're all fragile. We can't control everything, and we can't predict what's going to happen. That realization was terrifying, but it also freed me. It was a wake-up call that forced me to face my fears, not just the fear of dying, but the fear of living with regret, of letting my life pass by without truly experiencing it. I had to ask myself, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? What if I let go of the need to be perfect, to always succeed, to never make a mistake? What if I stopped worrying about what others thought of me? The answer was clear. I would be freer. I would live authentically, without the constant weight of anxiety. I would embrace the uncertainty of life, knowing that it was okay to fail, to take risks, and to not have all the answers. The fear was never going to go away completely, but I could choose not to let it control me. And so, I started facing my fears, one at a time. I began taking small risks, putting myself out there in ways I never would have before. I made decisions that felt uncomfortable but aligned with my true self. And with each step, I grew stronger. It was a slow process, but it was worth it. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. I knew that life was unpredictable, and that I couldn't control everything. But I could control how I faced it. And that, in itself, was liberating. While I was recovering, I also began to reevaluate my relationships, especially the ones that had become strained or distant over the years. The whole experience had shifted my perspective on what really mattered in life. People who I had once thought were integral to my world suddenly felt less important, while others, some of whom I hadn't expected to matter so much, became central to my recovery. I realized that my relationships needed to be more intentional. I'd spent too much time just letting things drift, assuming people would always be around, and not putting in the effort to nurture the connections that mattered. But after everything I went through, I understood that time and energy spent with the right people was one of the most valuable things I could give myself. I reached out to old friends, some I hadn't spoken to in years. It wasn't about rekindling every relationship, but about reconnecting with the ones that truly mattered, the ones that made me feel seen, heard, and supported. I also let go of relationships that had drained me, those that were based on shallow connections or toxic dynamics. It wasn't easy. There were conversations that I put off for a while, things I'd ignored or avoided, fearing confrontation or conflict. But eventually, I knew I had to address them. I needed to apologize to people I had hurt, and I needed to forgive those who had hurt me. The weight of unresolved issues had been pulling me down for far too long. I started letting go of grudges, recognizing that holding on to anger was only harming me, not the people I was angry at. It wasn't about forgetting, but about choosing peace over resentment. I made peace with the past and stopped letting old wounds control my present. I also became more intentional with the people who were still in my life. I learned how to be more open, more vulnerable, and more honest with my loved ones. I stopped pretending that everything was always fine, and allowed myself to be real. In turn, those relationships grew stronger. Through all of this, I learned that the quality of relationships matters more than the quantity. It wasn't about having a wide circle of acquaintances, it was about having a small group of people who truly had your back, who made you feel safe and valued. And that was something worth fighting for. One of the most difficult aspects of everything I went through wasn't just the physical recovery, it was the emotional healing. In the weeks and months after the pulmonary embolism, I realized I was still holding on to a lot of unresolved feelings. Feelings of betrayal, regret, and even guilt. The stress had taken a toll on me long before the medical crisis, and the experience only magnified all the unresolved issues I had buried. One of the hardest things to come to terms with was the guilt. I kept thinking about all the times I had neglected my health, ignored the warning signs, and pushed myself too hard. I blamed myself for not listening to my body, for not being more aware. I had been so focused on external achievements that I failed to care for the internal, the one thing that truly mattered. But as I healed, I began to realize that holding on to guilt wasn't helping me. In fact, it was only prolonging my suffering. I had to forgive myself. I had to acknowledge my mistakes, learn from them, and let go of the burden I had been carrying for so long. It wasn't easy. It took time, and it took work. But the more I practiced self-compassion, the lighter I felt. I also realized that forgiveness wasn't just for myself, it was for others as well. I had carried grudges against people who had hurt me in the past, people who I felt had betrayed me or failed me. It wasn't until I came face to face with my own mortality that I understood how much energy I had been wasting on these negative emotions. Anger, resentment, and hurt, none of it changed the past, and none of it served me in the present. So, I started the process of forgiveness. It wasn't about excusing anyone's actions or forgetting the pain they caused. It was about releasing the hold that those feelings had on me. I began to let go of the bitterness I had been carrying. I called people to apologize where I had wronged them, and I reached out to those who had hurt me, not to reopen wounds, but to offer peace and closure. In some cases, I had to forgive people without them even knowing. Sometimes, forgiveness doesn't require an apology from the other person, it's something you do for yourself. By forgiving, I freed myself from the shackles of anger and resentment. It was like taking a deep breath after holding it in for years. The journey to forgiveness wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others. But with each step, I felt lighter. I felt freer. And as I started forgiving others, I realized that I was also forgiving myself. And that made all the difference.